When I was 13, my dad threw me out of the house because my stepmom, Laura, suddenly couldn't stand me anymore. Now, after years of silence, he wants me back. Let me break it down. It all started in early 2020, during the first wave of pandemic lockdowns. At that time, things between Laura and me were actually good. I mean, she had been in my life for a while, and honestly, I considered her a second mom. She was kind, treated me fairly, and we got along well. I didn't feel like a burden or an outsider in her presence. So, when she announced she was pregnant, I was thrilled. I was ready to be a cool big sister, helping with the baby and being part of this new chapter for our family. My mom, Rachel, a surgeon, was working insane hours because of the pandemic. Her job became all-consuming, so I ended up staying with my dad, David, and Laura for what was supposed to be a short while. But lockdowns dragged on, and I stayed there indefinitely. At first, things were chill. We spent time watching movies, playing games, and just doing typical lockdown stuff. I genuinely thought this was going to be a bonding period for us. I had no idea things were about to go downhill. Around the 4th month of Laura's pregnancy, everything changed. It was subtle at first, tiny comments here and there. If I accidentally left a sock on the floor, she'd snap, but I brushed it off. Everyone was stressed with the whole world in chaos, and pregnancy hormones were probably making things harder for her. But those little moments didn't stop. They escalated fast. Suddenly, I couldn't do anything right in her eyes. If I sat quietly in the living room, she'd sigh dramatically, like I was polluting the air by existing. I started retreating to my room to avoid confrontations. I only left to do chores or grab a snack. Still, that wasn't enough. Laura found reasons to be angry at me even when I wasn't around. One day, she barged into my room, screaming about how it stank so bad that she was going to be sick. I was dumbfounded. There was nothing in the room except an open bag of chips. I didn't even have time to process what was happening before she started crying, like I had committed a crime. Dad came running in, comforting her while I just stood there, completely confused. His explanation? Pregnancy hormones. But to me, it wasn't just hormones. It felt deliberate, like she was finding reasons to hate me. And it wasn't an isolated incident. Every day, she seemed to be on a mission to find fault with me. If I finished my chores and dared to relax, she'd accuse me of being lazy. If I washed dishes, she'd huff that I wasn't fast enough. No matter what I did, I was wrong. The worst part? My dad didn't have my back. He never once stood up for me. Every time Laura exploded, he'd go into peacemaker mode, telling me I needed to understand that she was under a lot of pressure. He never asked how I felt, not once. I became invisible, just a ghost in the house who wasn't allowed to take up space. I tried to talk to him about it, ask why Laura was treating me this way, but he'd dismiss it every time. "She doesn't mean it," he'd say. "She's just stressed." But it didn't feel like she didn't mean it. It felt intentional, and over time, it broke me down. I started to believe I was the problem. I'd lie awake at night, heart pounding, terrified that my dad was going to come into my room and tell me to pack my things. The fear ate away at me. My mental health nosedived. I felt alone, unwanted, and unloved. Walking through the house became unbearable. Every step was like navigating a minefield. Eventually, my fears became reality. One night, after another one of Laura's outbursts, my dad called me into the living room. His expression was heavy, almost like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He told me that it might be best if I went to stay with my mom for a while, just until things calmed down. There was no mention of how I was feeling or how unfair it was to push me out like that. No apologies, just a decision made for Laura's peace of mind. I packed a small bag, trying not to cry. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of knowing how much it hurt, and just like that, I was out. 13 years old, kicked out of my own home because my presence was inconvenient. My mom took me in without question. She didn't press for details right away, just let me settle in and breathe for the first time in months. I slowly began to heal, though the damage lingered for a long time. Now, years later, my dad's calling, saying he wants me to visit. Apparently, things didn't turn out so well with Laura after the baby was born. He's acting like nothing happened, like he didn't throw me away when I needed him most. And honestly, I don't know if I can ever forgive him. The anxiety had gotten so bad that my hair actually started falling out in clumps. I would just sit there in shock, pulling out handfuls and wondering how my life had spiraled out of control so quickly. I genuinely tried to make things better. I really did. I started doing more chores around the house, going out of my way to be helpful and invisible at the same time. I scrubbed the kitchen spotless, did the laundry, vacuumed, you name it. But no matter how hard I tried, it was never enough. Laura would always find something to complain about. One day, it was the way I folded the towels. The next, It was a cup I had left in the sink for too long. It was never ending. But it was not just about chores. The entire atmosphere in the house was oppressive, like a storm cloud hanging low over everything. The air felt thick, tense, as if any moment something or someone was going to explode. I lived on high alert, never able to relax. I could not just be a regular kid. I dreaded stepping out of my room. Even with headphones on, trying to drown out the tension, it was impossible to escape. The stress was suffocating, and I could feel it eating away at me. I tried to pretend it did not bother me, but deep down, I was breaking apart piece by piece. I wanted nothing more than to go back to my mom's house, but that was not an option. The pandemic had turned everything upside down, and with her hectic work schedule, I was stuck. Every day felt like walking a tightrope, never knowing when Laura was going to snap or when my dad would finally decide I was not welcome anymore. I started to believe that maybe Laura did not want me there at all. The thought terrified me. I was only 13. If things got worse, where could I even go? I had no answers, but I knew one thing for sure. This situation was only getting worse. Then, on what was supposed to be a regular day, well, as regular as life could be in that house, I was in the kitchen, scrolling through my phone. I was just passing the time, waiting for my cereal to get soggy. Yeah, I know it's weird, but that's how I like it. I was not making a mess, not being loud, just sitting there, minding my own business. Laura walked in, and right away, I could feel the shift in the air. She didn't say anything at first, just scanned the kitchen like she was searching for something, anything, to criticize. But the place was spotless. I had cleaned it that morning, dishes done, counters wiped, everything in its place. Still, she let out this annoyed huff, like the mere sight of me was enough to ruin her day. Then, she started cleaning, aggressively. Dishes clattered in the sink, and she scrubbed the counters like they were caked in grime, even though they were already spotless. All the while, she muttered under her breath about how some people did not know how to clean up after themselves, how the kitchen was always a disaster. I just stared at my cereal, trying not to react. I knew if I said anything, it would blow up. But then she crossed the line. Without a word, she walked over, grabbed my bowl of cereal, untouched, and dumped it straight into the trash. No hesitation, no reason. I had not spilled anything, there was no mess. It was like she wanted to prove that whatever I was doing, it did not matter. I sat there in shock for a second, then something inside me snapped. All the frustration, the stress, everything I had been bottling up for months came rushing out. I slammed my hands on the table and yelled, "What is your problem with me?" Laura froze, her eyes wide like she had not expected me to push back. "Why do you hate me so much? I have not done anything to you, and all you do is treat me like garbage." For a moment, she just stood there stunned. Then, as if on cue, the tears started. Full-on sobbing, like I had just said the most hurtful thing imaginable. Before I could say anything else, my dad came rushing in from the living room like he always did when Laura started crying. "What's going on?" he asked, though it was one of those questions where he already had his mind made up. He did not want an explanation. He wanted to take her side. Laura, still crying, started rambling about how I was making her life miserable, how I was stressing her out and making her uncomfortable in her own home. I waited, hoping my dad would at least give me a chance to explain, to share my side of things. But he did not. Instead, he turned to me with a stern look and said, "What did you do?" It was like everything that had just happened was my fault by default, as if I had committed some unforgivable act that justified the tears streaming down Laura's face. I stood there in shock, staring at both of them, unable to speak. Then she dropped the bombshell that would change everything. "I don't want her around my baby," Laura choked out between sobs. "I can't handle this stress. It's not good for me, and it's definitely not good for the baby. She needs to leave." My dad's reaction? He didn't ask for my side of the story. Nope. He just walked me to my room like I was some kind of criminal. He closed the door behind him, his face somber, like he was about to deliver some life-altering news. My heart pounded in my chest because I knew deep down that whatever he said next would redefine our relationship. "You must be doing something to Laura," he finally said. "No one hates a kid for no reason. You need to stop stressing her out or you'll have to leave. I can't have her this upset while she's pregnant. It's not good for her or the baby." It felt like the ground had just vanished beneath me. I couldn't even process what he was saying. Laura wanted me out of the house. And instead of defending me, instead of even trying to understand what was going on, my dad took her side without a second thought. It was like I didn't exist, like I was just an inconvenience that needed to be dealt with. I stood there, numb, a million chaotic thoughts racing through my mind. None of them made sense. All I could feel was this unbearable weight crushing my chest. Finally, I just nodded, grabbed a bag, and started throwing clothes into it. What was the point of staying somewhere I clearly wasn't wanted? Not after everything that had happened. Back in my room, I locked the door behind me and immediately turned to social media. I posted about the situation, explaining everything. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I didn't care if people thought I was being overdramatic. I just needed to get out. The notifications came flooding in almost immediately, but I ignored them. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with essentials, and climbed out the window. It wasn't exactly difficult. My room was on the ground floor and I'd done it before. I had no clue where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from that house. I walked for what felt like ages, probably around 30 minutes before I decided to turn my phone back on. More messages, my dad, Laura, even people commenting on my post. I couldn't deal with any of it. I turned the phone off again and kept walking. Eventually, I made it to a friend's house. Her parents were incredibly kind and let me stay the night without prying. I didn't give them the full story, just said that things were bad at home and I needed a place to crash. Thankfully, they didn't ask for more details. I sent my mom a message from my friend's phone telling her what happened. She couldn't call me right away since she was in the middle of a surgery. She's a nurse, but she promised to send my Aunt Maggie to pick me up the next day. That was enough for me. I just needed space to breathe. That night, as I lay on my friend's couch, I couldn't stop replaying my dad's words in my head. No one hates a kid for no reason. Over and over like a broken record. The longer I thought about it, the angrier I became. How could he believe that? How could he assume I had done something wrong without even asking me? I had bent over backward to avoid conflict, to help around the house, to keep the peace, and yet this was how they repaid me. I knew right then and there I wasn't going back, not after the way they treated me. The next morning, I woke up feeling numb. It was like my brain hadn't fully processed everything that had happened. I knew I was done with that house, but the reality of it all still hadn't hit me. My friend's parents were incredibly sweet. They didn't press me for information, just gave me breakfast and let me relax in the living room. I didn't want to talk about it. I was emotionally drained. I wasn't even sure how I felt anymore. Mostly just exhausted. Around midday, my Aunt Maggie arrived. The sight of her brought a strange sense of relief and dread all at once. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but at least for now, I had somewhere safe to go. Maggie gave me that look people give when they know something's off but don't want to push too hard. You know the one. It's a mix of concern and quiet support, like they're silently saying, "I'm here if you need me, but no pressure." We didn't talk much as she drove me back to her place after helping me grab my stuff from my friend's house. And honestly, I was grateful for the silence. Being at Maggie's always felt safe. A kind of sanctuary. She's that rare adult who just gets it. No endless lectures, no judgments, and most importantly, no forcing you to spill your guts when you're not ready. When we pulled into her driveway, I reluctantly turned my phone back on. Big mistake. The notifications hit me like a tidal wave. Texts, missed calls, and voicemails. Most of them from my dad. He must have tried calling me at least 20 times last night. The messages were endless. A few from him, some from Laura, and then a bunch from other family members. I didn't even bother scrolling through them at first. It was too overwhelming. I needed a break from all that noise. I did text my mom, though, letting her know I was safe. She already knew, of course, since she had been in contact with Maggie, but I still felt like I owed her that much. She texted back immediately, saying she was relieved and that we'd talk when she got a moment to breathe from work. I knew hospital shifts were hell for her lately, and the last thing I wanted was to add to her stress. Meanwhile, I could only imagine how my dad was handling things. He had probably flipped out when he realized I wasn't at the house and hadn't responded to his calls. But here's the thing, I didn't care. He was the one who made me feel like I didn't belong there. What did he expect? An apology wasn't going to magically undo the damage from last night. I couldn't face hearing more excuses or listening to him try to twist the narrative, making it seem like I was overreacting. Still, the weight of it all began to sink in. My grandparents, my dad's parents, were going to be livid. They were always fiercely protective of me, especially since I only lived with my dad part-time. They wouldn't take this lightly. I knew they'd be ripping into him the moment they got the full story. I could barely wrap my head around what their reaction would be. Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me, and I started going through the messages. My dad's text was exactly what I expected. Long-winded, apologetic in tone, but full of justifications. He kept defending Laura, saying she was stressed from the pregnancy and that I needed to be more understanding. Right. Because her stress apparently gave her a free pass to treat me like garbage. It was classic dad, always trying to make peace by placing the responsibility squarely on my shoulders. Then there was Laura's message. It was short and infuriating. No apology, no acknowledgement of her behavior. Just a generic, "hope you're safe," followed by a guilt trip about how my leaving had caused stress for the family. Seriously, she had the audacity to act like I was the problem here. Not long after, things escalated. Family texts started rolling in, but my grandparents didn't even bother messaging me. They went straight to calling my dad out publicly. I guess his little missing person post on social media was supposed to get sympathy, but it totally backfired. People weren't feeling sorry for him. They were furious. The comments were brutal, with relatives demanding answers about why I would feel the need to leave in the first place. My dad's later text reeked of panic. He wasn't just upset that I was gone, he was freaking out because everyone knew now. His attempt to control the narrative had blown up in his face. Apparently, my grandparents didn't know the full extent of what had happened. They weren't aware that Laura wanted me out or what my dad had said to me. They thought I had just vanished without warning. Once they found out the truth, though, all hell broke loose. From the texts I saw, it sounded like my dad and Laura were going around to family friends, asking if anyone had seen me. It was almost pathetic the way they tried to spin themselves as victims now that the spotlight was on them. But I knew the truth. They weren't sorry because they missed me. They were sorry because they got caught. The more I read, the angrier I became, but it wasn't just anger, it was finality. I was done. Done trying to please them, done bending over backward to keep the peace. I couldn't unhear the things my dad had said, and Laura had made it painfully clear that she didn't want me around. No matter how much I had tried to help and fit in, it was never going to be enough for them. And I wasn't about to keep begging for scraps of acceptance anymore. Maggie must have sensed how drained I was because she didn't push me to talk about it. She just let me exist in that moment, giving me the space I needed. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could stop trying to survive their world and start building my own. Maggie gave me exactly what I needed that evening: space. She didn't pressure me or pry for details. Later, though, she quietly came to my room and asked if I wanted to stay with her for a while. I didn't even have to think about it. The answer was a resounding yes. Going back to my dad's house wasn't an option. The idea of bouncing between friends' couches just made me feel exhausted. Staying with Maggie, though, felt like a refuge from all the madness. Her home became my safe haven, a bubble where I could breathe without feeling judged or manipulated. The rest of that day was a complete blur. I spent hours scrolling through comments under my dad's post, reading every reaction like I was in some kind of trance. There were a few people defending him, those who thought I might just be another difficult teenager or that the stress of the pandemic was to blame. But most people sided with me. Many asked why a 13-year-old girl would even feel the need to run away from home in the first place. Even distant relatives chimed in, expressing their disappointment in my dad and wondering how things could have gotten so bad. As much as I appreciated the support, it didn't erase the hurt. No matter how many people condemned him, it did not change the fact that my own father had chosen Laura over me. It was crystal clear where his priorities lay, and I was not on that list. That reality clung to me like a heavy fog. Every time I checked my phone, hoping for clarity or some sense of relief, the pain just hit harder. Eventually, I gave in and sent my dad a text before bed. It was short and to the point. I told him I was safe and that I would not be coming back for the time being. I also mentioned that I was staying with Maggie and did not want to talk to him until I was ready. His response came almost instantly, but I did not even bother reading it. I was done for the day. As I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, it finally sank in that things would never be the same. Not with my dad, not with Laura. And surprisingly, I was okay with that. Over the next few days at Aunt Maggie's house, life began to feel somewhat normal, or as normal as it could after everything that happened. I kept getting messages from my dad, but I never opened them. I knew what he wanted to say without having to read them. He kept repeating things like, "We need to talk," or "Let's work this out," but he never once apologized. There was no acknowledgement of what he had said to me that night. It was still all about Laura, how I needed to be more understanding of her situation, how I should be more patient. It was maddening. Even after I made it clear I was not coming back, he was still choosing her over me. At some point, I had had enough. I blocked both him and Laura. I could not handle any more guilt tripping or being made to feel like the problem. It was not my job to fix their mess, and I was done letting them make me feel like I had to. Aunt Maggie was my lifeline through all of this. She never pushed me to talk about what had happened. Instead, she made sure I had the space and time to figure things out. She went above and beyond to make me feel at home, setting up the guest room with my favorite blankets and snacks. It felt good to have someone genuinely care about me without an agenda. One day, as we sat at the kitchen table, she gently asked, "Do you think you'll ever talk to your dad again?" There was no pressure in her voice. It was more like she was giving me the opportunity to process my feelings out loud. I did not answer right away. How could I? I was torn. Part of me wanted to believe my dad could make things right, but the other part of me, the part that had heard him say those awful things, did not see how that could ever happen. After a long pause, I finally said, "How do you move past something like that? I don't know. I want to talk to him, but I don't think I can forgive him, not after what he said." Maggie nodded thoughtfully. "That's fair. You do not have to decide anything right now. Take your time." Her words were exactly what I needed to hear. I did not need a solution or a timeline. I just needed space to figure things out. Meanwhile, my grandparents were livid with my dad. They had already pieced together what happened from his social media post and conversations with other relatives. I did not have to say a word to them. They knew. What surprised me most was how completely they cut him off. I knew they would be angry, but I never expected them to go that far. It was strange, almost comforting to know that others saw the situation for what it was. I was not alone in thinking he was wrong. Every few days, my grandmother would call me to check in. She never mentioned my dad, and I respected her for that. It was as though we had a silent agreement to leave that mess behind us. Instead, she would ask me how I was adjusting to life at Maggie's, how school was going, and whether I needed anything. I think deep down she felt guilty about the chaos that had unraveled in my life, even though she had no part in causing it. Her calls were a source of comfort, a reminder that at least one member of my family was genuinely on my side. Life at Maggie's house was like a breath of fresh air. The constant tension, the need to tiptoe around every conversation was gone. I did not have to analyze every word or brace myself for the next outburst. For the first time in a long while, I could just exist without fear. My days were simple but healing. I focused on online school, thank you pandemic, helped Maggie around the house, and tried to give myself room to recover emotionally. It might not have been exciting, but after months of living in survival mode, it was exactly the break I needed. Still, there was a nagging emptiness inside me. Even with the unwavering support from my aunt and grandparents, I could not shake it. I was relieved to be out of my dad's house, no doubt about that, but my thoughts kept drifting to my half-brother. I had never met him, and I feared that by keeping my distance from my dad and his wife, Laura, I might never get the chance to. He was innocent in all of this, and it felt unfair that I might lose the opportunity to know him because of the fractures in my relationship with my dad. I tried not to think about it too much, but it was difficult. Every time I imagined my future, I wondered if he would be a part of it. But going back to my dad's house was out of the question. I was not ready. Maybe I never would be. The thought of facing my dad again brought up too much pain and unresolved anger. One night, as I mindlessly scrolled through my phone, a notification popped up. My dad had posted something on social media. It was a long, self-pitying message about family and regrets. He did not mention me by name, but the entire post was clearly directed at me. He rambled about wanting to make amends and bring the family back together, as if posting vague, guilt-tripping messages for the world to see was some form of apology. Reading it made my blood boil. If he really wanted to apologize, he would have reached out directly, called my aunt, sent me a letter, anything but this. It felt like a cheap attempt to gain sympathy from strangers rather than truly take accountability for what he had done. I turned off my phone and threw it onto the bed. I was not going to let him pull me back into his drama. Not this time. The next morning, I told Maggie about the post. She shook her head with a knowing look and said, "That sounds like your dad. He doesn't know how to just admit he was wrong." And that was the heart of the problem. He wanted everything to go back to the way it was without ever acknowledging the pain he had caused. But I was not that person anymore. I could not pretend everything was fine just to maintain some illusion of family unity. I made a decision then and there. I unfollowed him on social media, blocked his number, and asked Maggie not to share any news about him unless it was absolutely necessary. I needed space to move on. As long as he kept trying to manipulate me back into his life, I would never be able to truly heal. Cutting ties was harder than I expected, though. There were moments when I missed him, missed the way things used to be before everything fell apart. I sometimes thought about reaching out, but then I would remember the cruel things he said that night and remind myself why I had to keep my distance. Moving forward was not easy, but it felt like the only choice I had. His life was falling apart and he wanted me to pick up the pieces. His wife, my stepmother, had turned on him, accusing him of being violent, aggressive, and even misogynistic. Apparently, the entire facade he had maintained was crumbling, and I was supposed to be his savior. The irony of it all was almost too much to handle. It was all fake. Every word, every accusation, it was like a bad rerun of a show I never wanted to see again. She was pulling the same manipulative garbage she had used on me all those years ago. Only this time, it was not me on the receiving end. It was him. When I first read his message, I felt this unsettling sense of déjà vu. I could practically hear her voice in my head, spewing out wild accusations like she had rehearsed them, twisting the truth so that she came out looking like the victim. She was a master at it, turning lies into sympathy and sympathy into control. I had been there before. I knew exactly what it felt like to be gaslit by her. But when she did it to me, it was so much worse because my dad had stood by her. He let it happen. Hell, he more than let it happen. He took her side. He even got physical with me when I tried to stand up for myself. And what was my reward? I got thrown out of the family, cast aside like I was the problem. That was the last time I ever stepped foot in that house. Now here he was, finding out what it felt like to be on the other side of her lies and manipulation. And you know what? It was hard to feel any sympathy for him. From what I could gather, she had ruined his reputation. She had turned all their mutual friends and their social circle against him. He was facing some serious legal troubles, accusations flying in from every direction, and no one wanted to hear his side of the story. She had painted him as this abusive monster, and now he was desperate. But what really got me was when he mentioned my grandparents. Apparently, when he went to them for help, they turned him away. My grandparents, the same ones who had always been in his corner, who stood by him through everything, disowned him. They told him he was not welcome anymore. And you know what the kicker was? They disowned him because of what he did to me. They told him flat out that after how he had treated me, he was no longer part of the family. It seemed they had finally reached their breaking point. Honestly, it did not shock me that they shut him out. My grandparents had always supported me, even when my parents were at their worst. Still, it was surreal hearing that they had officially cut ties with him. What did surprise me, though, was the condition they set for him. They told him that if he wanted any chance of reconciliation with them, he had to make amends with me first. That was the deal. No fixing things with me, no fixing things with the family. And that, of course, was the reason he reached out. Not because he felt guilty, not because he wanted to sincerely apologize for everything he had done. No, it was because he needed me to clean up the mess he had made. He wanted me to be his ticket back into the family. I could not help but laugh when I read that part. It was so typical of him. He had not changed one bit. He was not interested in making things right because it was the right thing to do. He only cared about doing whatever it took to get back in my grandparents' good graces. It had always been about him. Honestly, I was not even angry anymore. I was just done. The years of silence and distance had given me time to heal. Not completely, of course, but enough to see things clearly. I did not need him in my life. I had moved on without him. And now, because he had no one else left, he was trying to worm his way back in. So when he asked if we could talk things through, I did not hesitate. I told him no. Just no. No long explanation, no attempt to soften the blow. Just a simple, firm refusal. I was not going to be his lifeline. Not after everything he had done. Not because his wife had finally kicked him out and now he was drowning. Of course, he did not take that well. He sent a flood of messages trying to guilt-trip me into helping him. He pulled the "I am still your father" card, going on about how family should stick together during tough times, as if that had ever meant anything to him before. He kept insisting that we could work things out, but I saw right through it. He did not care about fixing things with me. He just wanted back in with the family, and I was the only obstacle in his way. I did not respond to any of his other messages. I blocked him and moved on with my day. It was not even difficult. There was no internal struggle, no second guessing. I had made peace with this situation a long time ago. He was not part of my life anymore, and that was not going to change just because he found himself on the receiving end of consequences for once. The truth was, he had made his choices. He chose to side with his wife when she was tearing me apart. He chose to believe her lies and push me away. And now that he was finally seeing her true colors, he expected me to swoop in and save him? No, that was not going to happen. He can deal with the fallout of his own decisions just like I had to. As for my grandparents, I respect their decision. They saw what he did to me, and they are holding him accountable for it. That is more than I ever expected. But as for fixing things between us, no. That bridge burned a long time ago. And honestly, I do not feel the need to rebuild it. So here we are. My dad's life is in ruins, and he is reaching out to me for help. Not because he wants to make amends, but because he has run out of options. And I am not interested. I am not going to be his way back into the family. I am not going to let him back into my life just because he is desperate. So yeah, I told him no, and I do not regret it for a second.